When I opened the letter from the HOA, my heart almost stopped. They fined me $150,000 for so-called violations on my own land. I bought fair and square years before their fancy neighborhood even existed. Their letter was dripping with arrogance, threatening to seize my property if I didn't pay up within 30 days. I could almost hear their smug laughter behind those typed words, imagining me scrambling to come up with the money. But here's the twist they never saw coming. I wasn't just some homeowner they could bully. While they thought they held the power, they never checked the deed records closely enough to know the truth. Because hidden inside those dusty county files was a secret that would flip the entire neighborhood upside down. They didn't own me a dime. In fact, I owned something far more valuably owned their entire neighborhood. Asterisk. The morning it all began didn't feel special at first. The sky over Oak Ridge was a washed-out gray, the kind that makes you want to stay in bed a little longer. I had been up late the night before, finishing some fence repairs on the backside of my property. My land stretched across 10 wide, rolling acres, plenty of space to breathe, think, and live without anyone looking over my shoulder. That was the whole point of moving here years ago. I wanted freedom. I wanted distance from the petty politics and power games that so often poisoned neighborhoods. My nearest neighbors were a half-mile away, tucked behind a gated community that liked to pretend it was its own little kingdom. I'd had no trouble with them before. We waved when we passed on the road, nothing more. It was peaceful. At least it used to be. When the mail truck pulled up that Tuesday morning, I almost ignored it. I was halfway through brewing my coffee when the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway made me glance out the window. The carrier left a single thick envelope in my box before driving off. From the kitchen, I could already see the bold, blocky letters printed across the front. Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. My first thought was that they'd made a mistake. I wasn't part of their subdivision. My land sat outside their gates, separated by a county-maintained gravel road. But the envelope was addressed to me, in big, unmistakable type. Curiosity won out over caution. I carried the envelope to the porch, sat on the top step, and slid it open with my paw. The first page was covered in dense legal wording, but one phrase in the center leaped off the paper. Notice of violation, total fines due, $150,000. My stomach dropped. I skimmed down the list, my eyes snagging on one ridiculous claim after another. Unauthorized structure constructed without approval. They meant the storage shed I had built last spring. Non-compliant fencing materials. That had to be the cedar posts I'd replaced along the pasture line. Removal of protected vegetation. I remembered the storm that knocked down a dead oak last summer, which I'd cleared to keep the area safe. They even included a vague accusation of landscaping alterations detrimental to the community aesthetic. I sat there, stunned, reading the words over and over as if they might change. The letter demanded immediate payment of $150,000 more than I'd ever had in my checking account at once. It threatened legal action if I failed to comply within 30 days, including foreclosure and seizure of the property. It was signed by the HOA president, a name I recognized from occasional chatter in the local diner, Karen Whitmore. She had a reputation around town for being strict, even ruthless, when it came to enforcing the neighborhood's endless list of rules. But how could any of those rules apply to me? I had never signed their charter. I never agreed to their bylaws. My land had been purchased independently, long before their gates even existed. For a long time, I just sat there with the letter in my lap, feeling a slow burn of anger spread through me. At first it was disbelief. Surely this was a clerical error, a misfiled parcel number. But as I read the language more carefully, I realized this wasn't a mistake. They were claiming authority over my property. They believed they had the power to fine me, to take my home if I didn't pay. The arrogance of it made my jaw tighten. I had heard stories about homeowners associations flexing their muscles, but I had never imagined they could reach outside their borders like this. I decided to call the number listed at the bottom of the notice. After 3 rings, a polished female voice answered. Oak Ridge, HOA offices? This is Marcy. How can I assist you? I explained that I'd received a violation notice but wasn't part of their community. There was a pause on the line, followed by a faintly condescending laugh. If you received a notice, sir, it means our records show you are subject to Oak Ridge, but perhaps you're not aware that your parcel falls within the Oak Ridge district. I tried to press her for details, but she deflected. If you have concerns, you may bring them to our office in person. President Whitmore handles disputes directly. Her tone suggested it wasn't a request. I hung up feeling more unsettled than before. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten on the porch railing. I paced the length of the deck, reading the notice again and again. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and forget the whole thing. But another part, the part that hated being pushed around, refused to let it go. They thought they could scare me into paying. They thought I'd just roll over because they used fancy legal language and big numbers. Not a chance. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked outside the HOA's headquarters. Their building was a sleek, modern structure of glass and stone, a sharp contrast to the simple brick storefronts around it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and money. A receptionist guided me to a waiting area where a row of leather chairs sat beneath framed photographs of manicured lawns and smiling families. I felt like a stranger in a place designed to make outsiders feel small. After a few minutes, a door opened and a tall woman stepped out. She wore a tailored navy suit and carried a folder under her arm. Her hair was perfectly styled, every strand in place. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, extending a cool, firm handshake. "I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Please, come in." Her office was immaculate, decorated with tasteful art and a wall of awards, recognizing excellence in community management. She motioned for me to sit across from her wide desk. Without preamble, she opened the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. "These are the violations recorded on your property over the past 18 months, she said. "You've constructed structures without approval, altered protected landscaping, and installed non-compliant fencing. These actions fall under the jurisdiction of the Oak Ridge HOA. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm. "With all due respect, Ms. Whitmore, my land isn't part of Oak Ridge. I never signed any agreement with your association. Your jurisdiction doesn't extend beyond your gates." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened. "According to our district maps, your parcel is within the Oak Ridge jurisdictional boundary. Whether you signed an agreement is irrelevant. Our bylaws apply automatically to all properties within the recorded district." The certainty in her tone made my stomach twist. Could she be right? Had I somehow missed something when I bought the land? I tried to remember the stacks of documents I had signed at closing years ago. Deeds, easements, services had all been a blur back then. I pushed the papers back across the desk. "I'll need to review my own records," I said evenly. "Until then, I'm not paying a dime." Karen's smile thinned. "You have 30 days to comply," she said, her voice cool as polished steel. "Failure to pay will result in legal action, including foreclosure if necessary. I strongly advise you to take this seriously." I left the office, with a folder of violations under my arm and a storm of questions in my head. Outside, the late afternoon sun glared off the polished glass of the building, making me squint. As I walked to my truck, I caught sight of the gated entrance to Oak Ridge in the distance. Beyond the black iron gates, the streets curved gracefully past rows of identical brick homes, each lawn trimmed to perfection. It looked peaceful from the outside, but I now knew better. Behind those gates, power and arrogance simmered like heat on asphalt. Back home, I spread the papers across my kitchen table and dug my old property file out of the gun safe. Dust rose as I flipped through the yellowing documents. My deed was there, signed and notarized, clearly describing my 10 acres and its boundaries. No mention of Oak Ridge, no mention of HOA jurisdiction. I checked the survey maps, tracing the lines with my finger. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, so how could they claim authority? As the sun set beyond the hills, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, I felt a slow determination settle over me. Maybe they thought they could intimidate me into paying. Maybe they thought I was just another landowner who wouldn't bother to fight back. But they were wrong. I wasn't about to let a group of strangers dictate what I could do on my own land. That night, I made a plan. Tomorrow, I would visit the county clerk's office and pull every record related to my property. If Oak Ridge really believed they had jurisdiction, I wanted to see exactly what they were basing it on. And if there was a mistake, a hidden detail buried in decades-old paper, where I intended to find it. As darkness fell and the crickets began their nightly chorus, I locked the documents back in the safe and leaned against the doorframe of my porch. The gravel road stretched silent and empty beneath the moonlight, a boundary between my world and theirs. Somewhere beyond those trees, Karen Whitmore and her board members probably believed they had me cornered. They thought they were dealing with an easy target. They were wrong. And deep down, a small voice whispered a truth I didn't yet fully understand. This wasn't just about a letter or a fine. Something bigger lay hidden in those dusty records, waiting to be uncovered. Something that would change everything. The next morning, I was awake before the sun. Sleep had been impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Karen Whitmore's cold smile and the bold numbers of that $150,000 fine flashing behind my eyelids. My mind kept circling the same questions. How could the Oak Ridge HOA claim jurisdiction over my land? Was there some hidden clause buried in my purchase documents? Could they really foreclose on property that wasn't even inside their gates? Each question only deepened the knot of determination in my chest. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for their lawyers to make the next move. If they thought they could bully me, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. By 6 a.m., I was on the road to the county clerk's office, a battered leather folder of my property records riding shotgun. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a weathered brick building with white columns that had seen more than a century of land disputes, marriages, and lawsuits. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. A few early risers milled around the lobby, but the records department was quiet, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Behind the counter sat an elderly clerk named Mrs. Calloway. I had seen her around town for years, always neat in her cardigan sweaters and silver-rimmed glasses. She looked up from her computer as I approached, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Morning," she greeted. "You look like a man with questions." I managed a small smile. "That obvious?" I set my folder on the counter. "I need to pull every record on my property: deeds, surveys, easements, anything connected to parcel number 1847B. The Oak Ridge HOA is claiming jurisdiction, and I need to know if there's any basis for it. Mrs. Calloway pursed her lips in thought, then nodded. That's a big request, but we can start with the deed chain and the subdivision maps. Oak Ridge has been a thorn in a lot of sides around here lately. She motioned for me to follow her into the back, where tall shelves of file boxes lined the walls like a paper labyrinth. For the next few hours, we sifted through dusty ledgers and yellowing maps. I traced the history of my land back through decades of transactions, each transfer of ownership recorded in careful handwriting or faded type. My property had once been part of a vast tract owned by a logging company in the 1950s. Later, a rancher bought it, then sold off smaller parcels over the years. Eventually, it ended up with the previous owner from whom I'd purchased it. None of the deeds mentioned the Oak Ridge subdivision, which didn't even exist until long after my land was first sold. See here, Mrs. Calloway said, tapping a large survey map with her pen. Oak Ridge was platted in the late 90s. Your tract was recorded in the county books decades earlier. These boundaries, she traced a line along the edge of the map, don't overlap with theirs. If they're claiming jurisdiction, it's because of something newer. Let's check the easements and annexations. We moved on to a series of more recent documents. That was when things began to get interesting. Among the thick stack of records, Mrs. Calloway pulled out a file with a faded blue cover. This might be something, she murmured. Inside was a set of utility easements filed about 15 years ago, granting the county permission to run water and sewer lines through several properties including mine. One page included a rough sketch of the easements, and I noticed a faint dotted line that extended beyond my southern boundary into what was now the Oak Ridge neighborhood. Looks like when they ran the utilities, they might have used an older property description, Mrs. Calloway said, squinting at the page. That dotted line here, that's an overlap. If Oak Ridge lawyers got lazy and used these easement boundaries when they filed their own district maps, they might think your land falls under their jurisdiction, even though it doesn't. I felt a spark of both frustration and relief. So this was likely a clerical error mistake buried in decades-old paperwork. But as I studied the map more closely, another detail caught my eye. The dotted line didn't just overlap into Oak Ridge, it extended deeper into their development than I expected, cutting through the center of the neighborhood and even across the land where their clubhouse now stood. What happens if my deed predates theirs? I asked, tracing the overlapping section with my finger. Mrs. Calloway looked at me over her glasses. If your deed is older and it is then your claim takes priority. The HOA might think they have jurisdiction, but legally, you'd have the stronger right to that overlapping area. Depending on how the filings were done, you might even own parts of their roads or common areas. Her words hung in the air like a lightning strike. The idea that I could have rights inside their gated community was almost too much to process. I had come here worried about a fine, and now it seemed I might hold the upper hand. Can I get certified copies of all of this? I asked quickly. Mrs. Calloway nodded. I'll pull everything you need. You should also get a title attorney to review these documents. If the HOA tries to enforce anything, you'll want professional backing. I thanked her and left the office with a heavy stack of papers under my arm and a mind racing with possibilities. Driving home, I replayed my conversation with Karen Whitmore in my head. Her confidence, her dismissive tone, it all made sense now. She truly believed the HOA's maps gave them power over me. But she had no idea that the very records she relied on contained the seeds of their downfall. Back at the house, I spread the documents across my dining table like a general laying out a battle plan. My original deed, the utility easements, the subdivision maps, they formed a paper trail that told a story more powerful than any threat Karen could deliver. My deed clearly predated the Oak Ridge plat. The utility easements created a tangle of overlapping rights that their lawyers had apparently never noticed. And that dotted line cutting through their clubhouse property, that was the kind of detail that could unravel their entire claim. As I studied the papers, I began to think strategically. Simply proving my independence from the HOA would protect me from their fines. But the overlap opened a different door entirely. If I truly owned even a sliver of their common land, I could demand compensation. I could charge them for using my property. I could even restrict access if they refused to negotiate. The thought was intoxicating, but I knew better than to act rashly. Karen Whitmore struck me as the kind of person who thrived on confrontation. If I tipped my hand too soon, she would rally her board and their lawyers to fight back. I needed to be patient, careful, and absolutely certain of my facts. That evening, I called an old friend from high school, Tom Richards, who now worked as a real estate attorney in the next county over. Tom was the kind of lawyer who preferred quiet wins over loud arguments. Exactly the type of ally I needed. I explained the situation, reading key passages from the documents as he listened. Sounds like a classic jurisdictional overreach, he said after a long pause. If your deed predates their plat and you have overlapping rights, the HOA doesn't have a leg to stand on. They can send all the letters they want, but legally, they're trespassing if they're using land that falls under your deed. I asked if he would review the paperwork and prepare a formal response. He agreed immediately. Send me everything tonight. I'll draft a cease and desist letter to stop their harassment. And if you really do own parts of their development, we can explore your options for compensation. This could turn out very well for you, my friend. After we hung up, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the hills. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of pine from the woods behind my property. For the first time since opening that letter, I felt a sense of calm. The HOA might think they were in control, but the land itself told a different story, one written decades before Karen Whitmore ever set foot in Oak Ridge. Still, I couldn't shake a lingering unease. People like Karen didn't give up eyes. If she felt her authority threatened, she would fight to protect it. And if the rest of the board learned that parts of their neighborhood might legally belong to me, panic could drive them to desperate measures. As darkness settled over the property, I locked the documents in my safe and poured myself a stiff drink. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. But now I had something far stronger than anger or fear. I had proof, and with that proof came a quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need shouting or threats. Tomorrow, I would send the documents to Tom and let him draft the first shot across the HOA's bow. For tonight, I sat back and listened to the crickets, a slow smile spreading across my face. They thought they could find me. They thought they could claim my land. They had no idea the ground beneath their perfect lawns and polished sidewalks was already mine. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose humming in my chest. The fear that had followed me since opening that first HOA letter was gone, replaced by something steadier and far more dangerous. Quiet confidence. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, set my laptop on the kitchen table, and began scanning every page of the documents Mrs. Calloway had helped me find. Each file went into a neatly labeled folder for Tom Richards, my attorney and longtime friend. The more I reviewed the paperwork, the more certain I became. The Oak Ridge HOA had not only overstepped, they had built their entire empire on a foundation of sand. My deed was older, my claims were stronger, and their supposed jurisdiction was nothing more than a bluff, supported by sloppy filings. By 8 a.m. I had uploaded everything to Tom's secure drive. I followed the upload with a short email summarizing the key details. The easement overlaps, the predated deed, and the shocking fact that portions of their roads and clubhouse land fell within my legal boundaries. As I pressed send, I imagined Karen Whitmore and her board sipping their morning coffee, blissfully unaware that the ground under their manicured lawns had already shifted. Tom called a few hours later, his voice carrying a mix of excitement and disbelief. "I've gone through the documents," he said. "You weren't kidding, this is a mess. Your deed predates the Oak Ridge plat by nearly 20 years. Their own filings reference utility easements that include portions of your land, and the survey markers show their clubhouse sits partially inside your property lines. They've been trespassing for years." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So what does that mean legally?" "It means," Tom replied, "you're in an incredibly strong position. We can issue a cease and desist letter to stop their harassment immediately. More importantly, we can demand compensation for their use of your land. Roads, utilities, common areas, anything built inside your boundaries is subject to negotiation. They'll have to pay to keep using it, or face eviction proceedings." The word eviction sent a thrill down my spine. The image of Karen's perfectly curated neighborhood facing road closures and property disputes was almost too delicious. But Tom's voice was steady and practical. "I recommend we start with a formal notice of ownership and a demand to rescind their fines. We'll give them a chance to settle quietly before we escalate." "Let's do it," I said without hesitation. Tom promised to draft the letter and have it ready within 24 hours. Before hanging up, he added, "Be prepared for pushback. People like this, especially HOA boards, don't like being told they're wrong. They'll fight hard before admitting defeat." I spent the rest of the day walking the edges of my property, mentally tracing the invisible lines that now carried so much weight. The woods behind my house were alive with the sounds of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the paved streets of Oak Ridge, where children played and sprinklers ticked across emerald lawns. They had no idea their playground rested partly on land that wasn't theirs. I wondered how Karen would react when the truth reached her polished desk. Would she deny it, threaten me again, or would the fear of public humiliation force her to negotiate? The next afternoon, Tom emailed the finished letter. It was a masterpiece of quiet legal force. In calm, measured language, it laid out the history of my property, the predated deed, the overlapping boundaries, and the precise areas where Oak Ridge structures encroached. It demanded an immediate withdrawal of all fines and a formal acknowledgement that my property lay outside their jurisdiction. More than that, it invited the HOA to discuss a lease agreement if they wished to continue using any portion of the land that legally belonged to me. The deadline for their response was set at 10 business days. I printed the letter, signed it, and drove into town to deliver a certified copy to the HOA office. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced smile, accepted the envelope without comment. But I caught the quick flicker of curiosity in her eyes as she read the return address. I almost felt sorry for her, knowing the storm that envelope carried. Almost the next 3 days passed in an uneasy calm. I spent my mornings repairing fences and tending to small projects around the house, But my mind kept drifting back to Oak Ridge. Every time a truck rumbled down the gravel road, I wondered if it carried one of their board members coming to confront me. I imagined Karen pacing her immaculate office, reading and rereading Tom's letter as the reality of her situation sank in. On the fourth day, the call finally came. My phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, and I answered to hear a clipped, icy voice. "Mr. Miller, this is Karen Whitmore of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. We received your letter." I kept my tone polite but firm. "Good afternoon, Ms. Whitmore. I trust you've reviewed the documents." "We have," she said sharply, "and we dispute your claims. Our maps clearly place your parcel within Oak Ridge jurisdiction." With respect, I replied, "Your maps are irrelevant when compared to the original deed. My attorney has verified the filings with the county clerk. The evidence is clear." There was a long pause on the line, followed by a faint exhale. "We would like to meet in person to discuss this matter further." Of course they would. "I'm available tomorrow morning," I said. 9 o'clock at your office." "That will do," she said, her voice tight. Before ending the call, I arrived at the HOA headquarters the next morning with Tom by my side. His calm, confident presence was a steady anchor as we entered the sleek lobby. The receptionist led us to a conference room where Karen and 2 board members waited. Karen wore another perfectly tailored suit, but her smile lacked its usual confidence. We exchanged brief pleasantries before Tom opened his folder and began laying out the evidence. He spoke clearly and methodically, referencing deed numbers, filing dates, and survey markers with the precision of a surgeon. Each fact landed like a hammer on the polished oak table. The board members shifted uncomfortably as Tom explained that Oak Ridge roads, utility lines, and even a portion of the clubhouse fell within my deeded property. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but Tom held firm. "Your jurisdictional map relies on an easement filing from 15 years ago," he said, tapping a highlighted section of the document. "That filing does not supersede the original deed, which clearly predates the creation of Oak Ridge. My client's property rights are senior and enforceable. Any attempt to collect fines or impose bylaws is not only invalid but constitutes harassment and trespass." The room was silent when Tom finished. One of the board members, a balding man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "What exactly are you demanding?" Tom slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Immediate withdrawal of all fines, a written acknowledgement that Mr. Miller's property lies outside Oak Ridge jurisdiction, and a proposal for a lease agreement if you wish to continue using the sections of land that overlap his deed. Failure to respond within the deadline will result in legal action, including the possibility of restricting access to roads and utilities." Karen's face tightened, but I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. She knew the truth as well as we did. Their entire community depended on those roads and utilities. Losing access even temporarily would throw their perfect neighborhood into chaos. "This is outrageous," she finally snapped. "You can't possibly expect—" "I expect you to respect the law," I interrupted, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Your association tried to fine me for improvements on my own land. You threatened foreclosure. Now you've learned that not only do you lack jurisdiction, but parts of your neighborhood rest on property I own. I suggest we work together to resolve this peacefully." The meeting ended with no final agreement, but the message was clear. The HOA had lost its leverage. Tom and I left the building with the quiet satisfaction of men who knew time was on their side. Over the next week, small signs of change began to appear. The threatening letters stopped. The HOA trucks that once patrolled the gravel road no longer ventured near my property. And then, on the 9th day, a certified envelope arrived at my door. Inside was a formal letter from the Oak Ridge Board. They withdrew all fines, acknowledged that my land lay outside their jurisdiction, and requested a meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial lease arrangement. For the overlapping areas, I read the letter twice before setting it down with a slow smile. The same people who had tried to bully me into paying $150,000 were now asking for permission to stay on land they thought they owned. The balance of power had shifted completely. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the stars blink into the velvet sky. The battle wasn't over. Negotiations would come next, but the hardest part was done. I had faced down the HOA and emerged stronger. They had tried to intimidate me with threats and fines, but the truth of the land had spoken louder than their arrogance. As the crickets sang and the cool night air settled around me, I allowed myself a quiet laugh. Karen Whitmore and her board had no idea how close they'd come to losing everything. And if they thought this was the end, they were wrong. This was only the beginning of a reckoning that would change Oak Ridge forever. The morning after I met with the county recorder felt different, as if the air itself carried the weight of a secret about to be revealed. The neighborhood was quiet when I stepped outside, but the silence was deceptive behind those polished doors and carefully trimmed hedges. The HOA board was busy plotting their next move. I had a folder of documents tucked under my arm, and a calm that came from knowing something they didn't. The irony was almost too rich. For weeks they had treated me like a trespasser, a nuisance, someone they could bully into submission. But every threat, every letter, every ridiculous fine had only tightened the noose they were unknowingly fashioning around their own necks. I drove toward the clubhouse where the emergency board meeting was scheduled. The parking lot was packed with shiny SUVs and sedans, the kind of cars that practically screamed, "I'm important." Inside, the board members were already seated at a long conference table, papers spread out like the blueprints of a battlefield. Karen, the HOA president, wore her usual sharp blazer and a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Beside her sat Mark, the treasurer, tapping a pen nervously against the table. The other members shifted in their seats, each of them tense but trying to look composed. Well, Karen began, her voice crisp and practiced. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. Even though you've been uncooperative, we need to discuss the unpaid fines and your continuing violations. The amount has now reached $150,000. If you don't comply, we will proceed with a lien and foreclosure process. This is our final warning." The room smelled faintly of polished wood and arrogance. I set my folder down and took my time opening it, letting the suspense stretch until Karen's tight smile started to twitch. "I appreciate the invitation," I said evenly. "But before we discuss fines, I think you should know what I learned from the county yesterday." Mark stopped tapping his pen. Karen tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "And what would that be?" I slid a stack of papers across the table. "These are the original land deeds for this entire development. The roads, the clubhouse, every square foot of common ground, Devin, the lots your homes are built on. According to the county records, I own all of it." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the room erupted. One board member let out a startled laugh. Another muttered something under their breath. Karen's face went pale, then flushed crimson. "That's impossible," she snapped. "We purchased our properties through legal channels. The HOA holds collective rights to the common areas." I leaned back, enjoying the moment. "You purchased your homes." "Yes, but the land beneath them. The original developer never finalized the transfer of ownership before dissolving the company. The county auctioned the rights quietly years later. And guess who bought them?" The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Mark finally picked up the top sheet of paper and scanned it, his eyes widening as he reached the stamped county seal and my signature at the bottom. This can't be right," he whispered. "Oh, it's right," I said. "I've paid the taxes on this land for years. You've been enforcing rules on property that technically belongs to me. Every letter you sent, every fine you threatened, it's all been on my land." Karen's voice trembled, but she forced it into a sharp edge. "Even if that's true, you can't just take over. There are laws, protections." "Laws I've followed to the letter," I interrupted. "Protections you've already violated by issuing fines without legal authority. You've been trespassing, harassing, and extorting me on property you don't own. And now, you owe me." The board members shifted uneasily, their carefully constructed power slipping like sand through their fingers. Karen's eyes darted to the others, searching for support, but no one met her gaze. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they realized what this meant. If I wanted, I could shut down their precious clubhouse, restrict access to the roads, even sell the entire neighborhood to a developer. "I'm not unreasonable," I said, my voice steady. "But the fines stop now. All harassment ends. And you will publicly acknowledge that you have no authority over my land. If you don't, I'll file trespassing charges and start billing you for back rent on every square foot of common property." Karen gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is blackmail," she hissed. "No," I replied calmly. "This is property law. You've spent months trying to break me with your rules and threats. I'm simply showing you the truth you've been ignoring." Mark cleared his throat, his earlier bravado gone. "Karen, we need to consult legal counsel before we." Karen cut him off. "No, this is ridiculous. We will fight this. We have lawyers." "And good," I said, standing, "because I already have mine. And if you want to fight, remember that every day you delay is another day you trespass on land you don't own. That's a lot of rent piling up." The room fell silent again, the weight of my words settling over them like a heavy fog. I gathered my papers slowly, making sure they saw every seal, every signature, every undeniable proof of ownership. Then I walked to the door, pausing just long enough to deliver the final blow. "And Karen," I said, glancing back with a faint smile, "next time you think about issuing a fine, remember whose driveway you're standing on." I left the clubhouse to the sound of muffled arguments and hurried whispers. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawns in a warm glow, but the neighborhood no longer looked as perfect as it once had. The carefully crafted illusion of control had cracked, revealing the panic beneath. Driving home, I felt a surge of satisfaction, but it wasn't just about winning, it was about justice. For weeks, they had treated me as if I didn't belong, as if their power was absolute. Now they were the ones scrambling, their empire built on nothing but paperwork that no longer held weight. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. In one house, I saw Karen pacing by a window, phone pressed to her ear. In another, a board member stood outside, speaking urgently to a neighbor. They were already plotting their next move, but it didn't matter. The game had changed and I held all the cards. Still, I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen didn't give up. They would try to fight, to claw back some shred of control. But the law was on my side, and the truth was undeniable. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt completely at ease. Whatever came next, I was ready. As the night deepened, I thought about how quickly power can shift. A single document, a forgotten deed, a quiet county auction, one small detail had turned their world upside down. And in that quiet moment, I understood something Karen and her board had never grasped. You can't bully someone who owns the ground beneath your feet. The next few days unfolded like a slow-motion storm. The HOA board tried to regain their footing, but every move only revealed how powerless they had become. I woke early one morning to the sound of cars gathering outside my property line. From my porch, I could see neighbors clustered near the clubhouse, their voices sharp with confusion and worry. Word of my revelation had spread like wildfire. People who once waved politely now glanced at me with a mix of curiosity and fear, whispering as I passed. It wasn't hostility, it was uncertainty. For the first time, they were realizing the rules they had followed so blindly might have no real foundation. By mid-morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to an attorney representing the HOA. Her tone was formal but laced with urgency. "Mr. Daniels," she said, "the board would like to meet with you as soon as possible to discuss a resolution." I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the frantic energy of people scrambling to hold on to a crumbling empire. We scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. I arrived at the clubhouse to find Karen waiting at the door. Her sharp blazer was gone, replaced by a softer sweater, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her stress. Inside, the board members sat around the table like students waiting for a principal. Gone was the smug confidence that once filled these meetings. Mark offered a weak smile, and two other members avoided eye contact entirely. "Thank you for coming," Karen began, her voice noticeably calmer than before. We've reviewed the documents you presented, and we've consulted with legal counsel. It appears that your claims are, in fact, valid." The words seemed to pain her as they left her mouth. I said nothing, letting the silence press in around them. Karen took a deep breath. "The board would like to propose an agreement. If you allow the HOA to continue managing community services, landscaping, security, we will immediately void all fines, retract all letters, and publicly acknowledge your ownership of the land. We simply want to ensure the neighborhood remains stable." It was an offer meant to save face, but I could hear the desperation beneath it. I leaned forward, my hands resting lightly on the folder of documents I'd brought as a reminder of my leverage. "I appreciate the effort," I said evenly, "but stability is built on truth. And the truth is, you've operated without authority for years. Before we discuss management, I need something more than an acknowledgement. I need a public statement of apology and a signed contract outlining that all future actions require my approval." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "That seems extreme," he said. "What's extreme?" I countered. "Is threatening a resident with foreclosure on property you don't control? What's extreme is levying $150,000 in fines for imagined violations. This isn't about revenge, it's about accountability." The room went quiet again. Karen's face softened, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw something almost like humility. "All right," she said finally. "We'll draft a statement of apology and a contract recognizing your authority. In exchange, we ask only that you allow us to continue maintaining the neighborhood under your oversight. The residents depend on these services." I considered her words. Despite everything, I had no desire to punish the families who lived here. Most of them were innocent bystanders, caught in the crossfire of Karen's relentless power games. "Fine," I said after a long pause. "You can continue maintenance, but only after I review and approve all budgets, decisions, and communications. And every resident will be informed of the new structure. No secrets." Karen nodded slowly. "Agreed." The meeting ended with a flurry of paperwork. The board's attorney drafted a preliminary agreement on the spot, and we signed it together. Watching Karen put her signature beneath mine was a moment I'll never forget. The very people who once tried to strip me of my rights were now acknowledging, in writing, that they answered to me. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as I walked to my truck, some offering tentative waves. I nodded back, knowing that by tonight the entire community would know the truth. That evening, I held a gathering on my property for any residents who wanted clarity. Dozens of people showed up, some nervous, others curious. I explained the situation in plain language, how the original land deeds had never been transferred, how I'd purchased the rights legally, and how the HOA had operated without real authority. There were gasps, murmurs, and a few sharp questions, but mostly there was relief. "So, what happens now?" a woman finally asked. "Life goes on," I said. "Your homes are still yours. Your lives don't change. But the HOA will no longer threaten you with baseless fines or enforce rules they have no legal power to impose. Maintenance will continue, but with transparency and fairness. If anyone tries to bully you, you come to me." A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but quickly growing. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt united not under the shadow of an overreaching board, but under a shared understanding of truth and fairness. As the crowd dispersed, Karen approached me. Her eyes held a quiet resignation, but also a hint of something unexpected. "I'll admit," she said softly, "I underestimated you. We all did. Apologize for everything. I studied her for a moment. It's not about me, I said. It's about doing what's right. Let's make sure this neighborhood becomes the kind of place where no one has to fight for their rights. She nodded, then walked away into the night. Over the next few weeks, the changes became clear. The threatening letters stopped. The absurd fines disappeared. Meetings that were once closed-door power plays became open forums where residents could speak freely. For the first time, people felt like their voices mattered. And though Karen remained on the board, her tone softened. Her approach collaborative instead of combative. As for me, I continued my life much as before, working my land, enjoying the quiet evenings, and watching as the community slowly transformed from a place of tension into one of cautious hope. Owning the neighborhood wasn't about control. It was about protection. And with the law on my side, I could ensure that no one would ever face the kind of harassment I had endured. Sometimes, I walked past the clubhouse and caught glimpses of the board meeting inside. They still debated landscaping budgets and security patrols, but the atmosphere had changed. The fear and arrogance were gone, replaced by something more grounded. Maybe they had finally learned what I had known all along. Real power doesn't come from titles or fines or threat. It comes from truth. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The battle was over, the land was secure, and the neighborhood was finally free from the grip of those who once believed they could rule through intimidation. If this experience taught me anything, it's that silence is the weapon of the oppressor. They thrive when you don't question, when you don't fight back, but the moment you shine a light on the truth, their power crumbles. That's the lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The HOA had fined me $150,000, thinking they could scare me into submission. Instead, they handed me the opportunity to reveal a deeper truth. I didn't just own my land, I owned theirs, too. And with that ownership came the power to dismantle their empire and rebuild something better. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the sky. I leaned back in my chair, a quiet smile playing at the corners of my mouth. The fight was over. Justice had prevailed. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at home. If you enjoyed this powerful real-life story, like, share, and comment your thoughts. Subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube for more eye-opening stories that reveal the truth behind everyday battles.